Tonight, we begin with a question that history only dares to mention in vague, trembling lines. What did King Xerxes do to his two daughters that people of ancient Persia described as something worse than death itself? It was not war. It was not a palace conspiracy. It was a kind of darkness that unfolded behind closed doors, a darkness that made even Greek historians, upon hearing it from Persian prisoners, pause their writing, unsure how to describe it. Tonight, we will slowly step into the story of Princess Artavastri and her younger sister, two young girls raised in the brilliant glow of the most powerful empire of the ancient world. On the surface there were jewels, silks, rituals, and authority. But beneath that radiance lay an invisible pressure. Strange ceremonies no child should ever understand, harsh expectations, and a level of control so suffocating it could silence even the bravest heart. And then one day, when she had only just stepped beyond childhood, Artavastri was called into her mother's chamber. Her mother carefully adorned her face as if performing an old ritual, one that every woman in the palace feared. After finishing, she whispered a single sentence that diverted the entire course of the young girl's life. "Tonight, the king will summon you, Xerxes." History does not record the details, but it records the consequences. From that night forward, the look in Artavastri's eyes was never the same. What happened to her and her sister eventually became a warning in Persian legend. Not all suffering takes the shape of death. Some kinds leave a person alive, yet no longer truly living. Before we go deeper, if you enjoy slow, chilling historical journeys like this, feel free to like and subscribe. But only if you truly want to stay with the channel. And where are you listening from? Which city? What time is it where you are right now? I always love imagining a small, quiet circle of listeners, each in a different time zone, sharing the same calm moment before sleep. Now, dim the lights. Let the soft whir of your fan or air conditioner hum in the background, and together, we will gently open the door to a story the ancient court tried to hide for centuries. In the chambers said to carry the fragrance of roses and myrrh within the royal palace of Pepilolis, a girl of about 15 years old knelt in a silence so deep it seemed to swallow her breath. Attendants moved around her with ceremonial precision, coating her skin in layers of precious oils, said to mark the highest honor a woman of the empire could ever receive. But she knew better than anyone that this honor was only a shimmering shell, a perfumed lie, crafted to hide the darkness waiting for her. Her fingers trembled, not from the thread of cold drifting through the marble corridors, but from a truth she did not dare shape into words. She did not fear death. In fact, death would have been mercy. What she feared was the man whom nations called the living God. In his eyes, she was no princess, no human, only an object placed before him because the empire willed it so. People often say that the body cannot lie. Hers certainly did not. The curve of her spine bent under an invisible weight. Her eyes, hollow and dimmed, seemed to carry the exhaustion of 4 decades despite belonging to a girl of 15. Her lips pressed into a thin, silent line, as if trying to hold back the past and the future at once. Everything in her posture whispered the truth she could not speak. It was as though time itself had aged her far beyond her years. Before we descend deeper into this slow unraveling, the story pauses for a moment, the way a storyteller might lift a finger gently and whisper to the listener to like and subscribe, promising that many darker histories remain waiting in the shadows. And then, softly, the tale returns to its path. To understand why King Xerxes would one day turn his own blood into victims, why a ruler worshipped across continents could gaze upon a child and see only dominion, we must journey backward to the beginning of his life, where the roots of his madness began to take form. Xerxes entered the world in the year 519 before Christ, born into the beating heart of a Persian empire that stretched across 3 vast continents. Its borders reached from the Indus River in the east to the edges of Greece in the west, from the burning sands of Egypt in the south to the cold, jagged peaks of the Caucasus in the north. Nearly 50 million subjects bent their heads beneath the word of his father, King Darius I. Power did not simply surround the infant Xerxes, it greeted him like a second cradle. From the moment he uttered his first cry, the priests of the court proclaimed that the child had been chosen by Ahura Mazda, the great god of light and order. This declaration wrapped him not in the tender warmth of motherhood, but in the heavy fabric of divinity. They did not raise him as a boy, they raised him as an embodiment of the sacred. Every ritual surrounding his infancy reinforced the same idea. He was not merely destined to rule, he was destined to transcend. Within this atmosphere, The world bent itself around him. Servants bowed until their foreheads brushed the floor. Nobles stepped backward rather than turn their backs on the cradle. Even the lullabies sung near him were hymns rather than songs of comfort. A child who never hears the sound of ordinary love grows up unable to understand it. A child who is told that his will is sacred grows into an adult who believes resistance is sin. Thus, the empire shaped him long before he shaped the empire. Beneath the golden ceilings of Pepilolis, prophecy and power interwove around his small body, tightening with each passing year. And while the girl in the perfumed chamber trembled beneath the weight of a fate she had not chosen, the origins of her suffering could be traced back to that cradle in 519 before Christ, where a single child was declared divine, and where a single destiny began to warp everything it touched. At the Royal Academy in Susa, the Zoroastrian magi taught him the same lesson every single day. A lesson repeated so often that it settled into his bones like the slow cooling of night air. You are the reflection of the divine. Your thoughts are sacred. Your will is law. They never spoke to him of kindness. They never mentioned philosophy or the responsibilities of a ruler toward the fragile hearts of his people. Instead, they planted only one seed, watered it with ceremony and obedience, and allowed it to grow unchecked. That absolute power was his natural state. Each ritual strengthened this belief, pressing it deeper into the soft clay of childhood. At sunrise, servants spoke his name as though invoking a god rather than a boy. During meals, high officials tasted every dish to show loyalty so complete that even death by poison was preferable to failing him. No one dared turn their back on him. No one lifted their gaze high enough to meet his eyes. Every gesture of the court was designed to teach a single message, that the world existed only to bend around him. His mother, Atossa, daughter of the great Cyrus, deepened this message further and darker. She had watched the royal line break and splinter under the weight of ambition, brothers poisoning brothers, mothers plotting against sons, cousins tearing apart the roots of the empire. She carried those memories like invisible scars, and she whispered her conclusions into the young Xerxes' ear. Only complete control, she said, guaranteed survival. Only fear could secure loyalty. Only possession could preserve love. Those whispers hardened the tender places inside him. They taught him that affection was a fragile and dangerous thing, unless held tightly, controlled thoroughly. They taught him that trust was a luxury no ruler could afford. They carved into him the belief that every heart around him was a potential threat, and therefore every heart must be subdued. By the time Xerxes reached the age of 20, these lessons had become the architecture of his mind. When his father died and the crown was placed upon his head, he did not step into kingship as a man still learning the shape of power. He stepped into it as someone who believed the empire was his body, and every person within it was a vein pulsing at his command. The land, the cities, the soldiers, the temples, they were not entities to guide or protect. They were extensions of his will. The early days of his reign were carved in iron and blood. A rebellion in Babylon rose like a spark, and he crushed it until not even ashes dared to remain. In Egypt, where the Nile carried stories older than memory, temples were burned until the stones themselves cracked from the heat. Scribes were impaled, their bodies left along the riverbanks as warnings shaped into human form. He allowed no space for negotiation, no hesitation, no mercy. His message drifted across deserts, mountains, and waters with chilling simplicity. To defy me is to defy the divine. A ruler raised as a god does not tolerate disruption. A child told that his thoughts are sacred grows into an adult who cannot withstand contradiction. And so Xerxes' early reign unfolded like a storm, loud, unyielding, inevitable. Every uprising was met with severity. Every whisper of dissent was extinguished before it could gather into sound. Those who lived under his rule learned quickly that obedience was not simply expected. It was demanded, with the weight of heaven pressing behind it. Yet beneath all the conquests, beneath the rituals and proclamations, there was something quieter shaping him. The teachings of Susa, the fearful wisdom of Atossa, the constant bowing of those around him, all of it formed a cocoon where no differing truth could enter. He was never permitted to understand the fragility of human hearts, the complexity of human needs. He was permitted only to believe in dominion. And dominion, once planted, grows like a tree whose roots choke everything around it. Thus, in those early years, while the empire trembled under his feet and the world whispered his name with reverence or fear, the seeds of something darker were already taking hold, an understanding of power not as responsibility, but as ownership, a way of seeing people not as lives to protect, but as instruments to command, a way of believing that to rule was not enough. One had to consume. The true trial emerged when Xerxes turned his gaze toward Greece. For him, it was not merely a campaign, not simply a clash of armies across distant shores. It was a sacred contest, a divine demonstration meant to prove that he was the living embodiment of a god. He commanded that a bridge of ships be built across the waters of the Hellespont so that nearly 1 million soldiers could, in his words, walk upon the sea. When storms shattered the bridge into splinters and foam, he did what no ordinary ruler would dare imagine. He ordered the sea to be whipped. He demanded that chains be thrown into the waves as punishment for daring to resist him. To his subjects, this spectacle seemed like holy theatre. To the rest of the world, it was unmistakable madness. Then came the defeat at Salamis, then the devastation at Plataea. The empire glowed red with ruin, and for the first time in his life, the man who called himself immortal learned that he could bleed. But a god who discovers failure does not become human. He becomes something far worse than human. When Xerxes returned to Pepalolis in the year 479 before Christ, he folded into himself like a wounded animal retreating into a shadowed den. The banquets that once filled the palace with music and light faded into silence. Foreign envoys waited endlessly for audiences that never came. His eyes changed, always tracing the edges of darkness, always searching for betrayal as if it were hiding behind every curtain, every pillar, every heartbeat. Suspicion seeped into him like a slow poison. From that point onward, his decrees drifted into a world detached from reason. He ordered an architect executed because the color of a tile displeased him. He had generals flayed alive simply for asking questions. The empire that had once moved with careful strategy and disciplined vision now lurched under the weight of paranoia. Decisions were no longer guided by counsel or calculation, but by the tremors of a mind unable to bear its own reflection. A ruler who once commanded continents now feared the shadows in his own halls. And the greater the fear grew, the more violently he reached for control, as though domination could mend the fracture inside him. Thus, the Persian Empire entered a season of silence, and trembling its grandeur dimmed, its people watching carefully, its fate slowly bending beneath the instability of a king who no longer trusted the world, nor trusted himself. The most terrifying truth unfolded behind the 15-meter-thick walls of the so-called royal arena, a place that had once been a conventional harem, but slowly transformed into a maze of dread. 360 concubines and countless slaves were gathered there from every corner of the empire. Egypt, Babylon, Lydia, India. Each month, new girls arrived, delivered like silent offerings to a ruler who no longer saw people, only possession. The arena functioned like a city sculpted from stone and gold, yet its windows were barred with iron, its corridors heavy with the scent of jasmine, meant to mask the aroma of fear. No woman who crossed its threshold ever returned. Not even generals were permitted to enter. Only Xerxes moved freely through its gilded gloom, wrapped in the absolute authority that no one dared question. From within this place, daughters were born dozens, perhaps hundreds, but they were nameless, unrecorded, erased before history could even glance in their direction. They grew up understanding that their bodies belonged to their father, the man proclaimed the god of light. They were not taught lineage or dignity. They were taught surrender. Their lives unfolded like candle flames burning in a sealed room, flickering briefly before disappearing into darkness. And then came the year 471 before Christ, 6 years after Greece had shattered the illusion of Xerxes' divinity. Mithrates, the guardian of the harem, would later whisper that this was the year everything changed. The year the emperor stepped over a boundary so monstrous that even those accustomed to silence felt something rupture inside them. The event centered on a girl barely 12 years old, her face bearing an unsettling resemblance to Atossa, the emperor's grandmother. That resemblance awakened in Xerxes an obsession that defied reason, an infatuation so consuming that no priest, no court scholar, no loyal advisor could explain or soften it. From the moment he noticed her, something dark and shapeless coiled around his mind. The world outside the arena, armies, nations, councils, diplomacy, faded into insignificance. The empire could crumble or burn, and he would not have noticed. His focus tightened until it became a single point, a single child, a single reflection of a lineage he believed belonged only to him. Within the arena, servants sensed the shift immediately. Their movements grew quieter, more mechanical, as though trying not to draw the attention of a sleeping predator. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with an unspoken dread. The corridors that once echoed faintly with laughter, even if that laughter had been forced, fell into oppressive stillness. Girls who had lived long enough to recognize changes in the emperor's moods retreated further into themselves, curling their bodies inward, as though bracing for a storm they could neither escape nor predict. For Xerxes, the storm took root in solitude. The humiliation of Greece had carved a hollow space inside him, a raw cavity filled with doubt, and instead of healing, that space drew in darkness. The defeat had shown him his mortality, and his mind recoiled from the discovery. In seeking to reclaim control, he reached not for wisdom or reflection, but for the most vulnerable beings, trapped within his grasp. The 12-year-old girl was not merely a child to him, she was a mirror, a symbol, a distorted echo of a lineage he believed he alone had the right to shape. Mithridates, watching from the edges of the arena like a man condemned to witness the collapse of a world, understood that something irreversible had begun. He later said that from that year onward, it was as if the emperor no longer walked among living men. His footsteps lost the rhythm of humanity. His eyes drifted not toward people, but toward shadows. Whatever part of him had once recognized limits or boundaries dissolved completely. The darkness that had long lingered behind him finally surged forward and swallowed his mind. And so the royal arena, already a prison of bodies, became a tomb of innocence. The empire outside still glittered beneath the sun, its banners stirring in the wind, its temples glowing with holy fire. But inside those 15-meter walls, where no truth was ever allowed to escape, the fate of countless forgotten daughters was sealed, and Xerxes himself crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The encounter with the young girl was prepared with the solemnity of a ritual meant for gods. Servants dressed in white moved with lowered heads, their steps slow and synchronized, as though each gesture had been rehearsed across generations. Every motion suggested sanctity, but beneath the softness of their movements lay a truth none of them dared to speak. The girl herself had been told that she would take part in a ceremony of cosmic balance, a sacred offering to maintain harmony within the empire. Not a single person whispered what the night truly held. Innocence was preserved only long enough to be broken. When darkness settled over the royal arena, the final fragment of humanity within Xerxes dissolved. Whatever remained of the boy who had once been cradled as a divine heir was extinguished completely. From that night onward, he no longer viewed the empire as something to nurture or defend. Nations, alliances, councils, these became distant abstractions, muted echoes beyond the walls of the arena. His attention narrowed to a single objective: the constant reaffirmation of absolute power over those who could not resist him. Conquest no longer occurred on battlefields. It occurred in rooms lined with marble and silence. By the year 468 before Christ, the palace had transformed into a vast container of fear, a place where the air itself felt weighted and stale. The girls within the arena were catalogued like inventory. Their ages were written down, their physical traits noted with clinical detachment. Height, complexion, the shape of their faces, the softness of their voices. Each detail entered scrolls and locked chests, as though these lives were nothing more than items in a merchant's ledger. Those deemed suitable for the emperor were placed in the highest tier, a ranking that held no privilege except proximity to danger. The rest were distributed as gifts, bartered like treasures to governors, envoys, and nobles, exchanged for loyalty or silence. Childhood did not exist in this world. There were no games, no lessons, no hopes of a future shaped by personal desire. There were only ranks, only positions, dictated by the whims of men powerful enough to reshape destinies with a gesture. The eunuchs who controlled the arena developed an administrative order as rigid and disciplined as the empire's armies. They recorded every audience, every summons, every disappearance. They assigned schedules, ensuring that rooms, meals, and rituals followed a pattern designed to eliminate unpredictability. They prepared medicinal ointments to soothe injuries, perfumes to mask bruises, and herbs to dull pain. They monitored wounds with the cold efficiency of battlefield physicians. Nothing was allowed to fall outside the system. In this realm governed by fear, documentation became a shield not for the victims, but for those who profited from obedience. The mothers of the girls were locked in adjoining chambers, close enough to hear their daughters cry, yet too far to intervene. They were prisoners of proximity, trapped in a torment where every sound sharpened their helplessness. Some resisted, and vanished within days, swallowed by silence deeper than death. Others lost their minds slowly, unraveling thread by thread as days blended into nights without hope. The few who endured learned to survive by erasing their reactions, by training their faces into masks of indifference. They watched without seeing. They listened without responding. To feel was dangerous. To speak was fatal. Within these walls, humanity became a liability. Empathy was a wound that could not heal. The palace, wrapped in gold and stone, became a place where each breath expanded and contracted under the weight of dread. And Xerxes, once a ruler who commanded millions, drifted further into a realm where domination was the only language he understood. The empire outside continued to move, markets bustled, soldiers marched, priests performed sacred rites, but inside the arena, time thickened into a slow, relentless tide of suffering. Thus, the royal palace of Persepolis, once celebrated as the radiant heart of the Persian Empire, became instead a hollow chamber in which innocence was catalogued, controlled, and consumed. It was here, behind its 15-meter walls, that the fate of countless forgotten daughters was sealed, while the man who claimed to be chosen by the god of light slipped further into the darkness he himself had created. No one within the palace suffered more deeply than the daughters born inside that sealed arena. They grew up in a world where obedience was treated as sacred, where fear itself was mistaken for devotion. Their language held no words capable of describing what was done to their bodies, and so they lived in a kind of emotional exile, drifting through their days like withered petals, forced to pretend they were still whole. Their bodies told stories their mouths could not. Shoulders collapsed inward as if carrying invisible weights, hands trembling without reason, smiles that stretched across their faces without ever reaching their eyes. Some girls never spoke again after enduring those so-called rituals. Others burst into sudden, uncontrollable laughter, as though madness had become the only doorway through which they could escape. Xerxes watched this slow wilt of innocence, the way a man might study his reflection in a cracked mirror, seeing himself fragment and distort with each passing day. His eyes, once bright with fire and ambition, grew dull and vacant. He no longer sought pleasure. What he sought was absolute submission. Part of this hunger sprang from the wound Greece had carved into him, the defeat that had humbled the one enemy capable of making him kneel. And with the sting of that humiliation came a need to forge a new battlefield, one where victory could never be denied, where he alone dictated the terms of existence. Within the labyrinth of the arena, he built such a battleground. It became an empire carved not from cities or provinces, but from the delicate, breakable spirits of those too young to resist. Only a small number of men ever witnessed the full extent of this decay. Among them was Artabanus, the commander of the royal guard. Though he was forbidden to intervene, the proximity of his duties forced him to hear what happened each night behind the arena's heavy doors. He heard the muffled cries that struggled to escape into the corridors. He heard whispered prayers rising like thin threads of desperation. And he heard the silences, those long, breathless voids that weighed more heavily than screams. Each sound etched itself into him, shaping an understanding he wished he had never gained. Years later, Artabanus wrote that the empire no longer smelled of power during that period. Instead, it smelled of rot, of something decaying from the inside out. It was not the death of enemies on foreign soil that haunted him. It was the quiet, suffocating death of a civilization collapsing beneath the weight of its own corruption. The palace still gleamed with gold. The banners still fluttered in the warm winds of Persia. Priests still lit sacred fires and chanted hymns to honor a king they declared chosen by the divine. But beneath the surface, beneath the rituals and the grandeur, something essential had begun to wither. What terrified Artabanus most was not the cruelty itself. Cruelty, he believed, had always existed in the world. It was the silence surrounding it, the deliberate, suffocating silence of those who had the power to stop the collapse, but chose to look away. Ministers who once spoke boldly now whispered only platitudes. Noble families avoided the arena grounds entirely, their eyes fixed on polished floors rather than on the truths seeping through the walls. Even the priests, guardians of sacred law, cloaked themselves in justification, convincing themselves that divine order required obedience, even when obedience meant complicity. Artabanus realized then that an empire does not die when its borders are breached or its armies falter. It dies when its people, those closest to its heart, refused to acknowledge the sickness festering within. And in Persepolis, sickness had become the air itself, quiet, unseen, inhaled with every breath by those who lived under the roof of a king drifting further into madness. The daughters suffered in silence. The palace held its breath, And the man meant to be the protector of millions continued to chip away at the humanity he had sworn to uphold, leaving behind only echoes of what the empire had once been. No tyrant exists in isolation. Xerxes was no exception. His power was fed not only by fear but also by those willing to close their eyes. The Persian nobility, the men who dined beneath golden ceilings, who wore garments embroidered with silver thread, knew exactly what unfolded behind the sealed doors of the royal arena, yet each of them pretended not to know. They called their silence loyalty, but in truth it was self-preservation disguised as virtue. Silence granted them benefits, vast estates, exemptions from taxes, marriages that strengthened political alliances, and gifts drawn from the very harem where suffering was cultivated. Corruption became a second religion, a quiet faith practiced by those who feared losing what privilege had given them. Even the Zoroastrian clergy, those meant to guard moral and sacred order, contributed to justifying the emperor's crimes. From the fire altars of Pepololes, they declared that the King of Kings ruled not only over men but over the fabric of creation itself. To oppose him, they said, was to oppose Ahura Mazda. Their voices wrapped Xerxes in divine immunity. Some priests went further, claiming that the daughters born within the arena were extensions of the holy light, meaning their bodies belonged to him by celestial decree. Thus, the educated transformed cruelty into doctrine, sanctified the unspeakable by calling it sacred duty. The imperial physicians added another layer to this machinery of complicity. They prepared soothing balms, herbs to dull pain, tonics to steady trembling hands. They created dyes to cover bruises, powders to conceal marks that should never have existed. Their reports were written in coded symbols, unreadable to anyone outside their circle of secrecy. Everything was done quietly, efficiently, cleanly, like a well-oiled mechanism designed not to heal, but to erase traces of wrongdoing. Medicine, the art meant to preserve life, became a tool to maintain the illusion of purity within the empire's darkest halls. Yet the most heartbreaking betrayal came from within the ranks of the girls themselves. The older daughters, who had endured the same rituals and carried the same invisible scars, were forced to assist in preparing the younger ones. They combed their hair, smoothed fragrant oils across their arms, and whispered the same comforting lies that had once been whispered to them. They repeated assurances they no longer believed, not because they wished harm upon the children, but because despair had reshaped their instincts. In their world, participation was survival, refusal was death. These young women moved through the arena like shadows guiding smaller shadows. Their hands were gentle out of habit, but their eyes were empty from resignation. They had learned that resistance led only to disappearance, swift, silent, absolute. And so they obeyed. They lied. They prepared the girls for the rituals that had destroyed them. They did so with trembling fingers, because the alternative was a fate even worse. To be dragged away, to vanish into a place where even whispers could not follow. In that twisted system, the family, normally a refuge, became an instrument of control. Mothers were imprisoned nearby, forced to listen but never intervene. Older daughters were turned into unwilling accomplices. Bonds of love, which should have been protective, were rearranged into chains linking victim to victim. The cycle of suffering fed upon itself, sustained by fear, by silence, by the unspoken belief that survival demanded surrender. And Xerxes, surrounded by a network of people who either adored him, feared him, or depended on him for status, found no resistance strong enough to challenge his descent. He drifted deeper into the delusion that he was untouchable, supported by priests who named him divine, by nobles who shielded him for personal gain, by physicians who concealed his violence, and by daughters too broken to flee. Thus the empire became not merely corrupt but complicit. Every pillar of society, religion, medicine, nobility, and even family folded into a single structure designed to protect one man at the cost of countless innocent lives. And the arena, hidden behind its walls of marble and gold, remained the silent heart of that terrible machine, beating steadily as the empire pretended not to hear. Mithrates, the keeper of the hidden chambers within the arena, was the one who witnessed everything. He memorized each night as though it had been carved into the walls, every ritual performed in trembling silence, every girl who vanished without a trace. He understood, more clearly than anyone else, that what Xerxes sought was never pleasure. Pleasure was fleeting. It could not fill the hollow left by defeat. What the king hungered for was affirmation. After the humiliation in Greece, after the sea and the battles had revealed his mortality, He needed proof, constant, brutal proof, that he was still a god, at least within these enclosed walls. Each act of cruelty became a way for him to remind himself that fate still bowed before him, that the universe had not stripped him of control. In his later confession, Mithridates would describe how dozens of girls were marked, broken, or erased entirely during those final years. Some disappeared, as though swallowed by the shadows of the arena. Those who survived moved like empty shells, drifting behind silk curtains with steps that barely touched the floor. Their eyes held no light, only the faint shimmer of what had once been innocence. Their voices had fallen silent. They existed like ghosts trapped between breaths. It was not desire, Mithridates wrote. It was the hunger of a man drowning in his own ambition, clawing for something to hold even as he sank. By the year 466 before Christ, fear seeped into the highest ranks of the nobility. Artabanus, who had witnessed scene after scene that felt carved from nightmares, understood that if he did not act, Xerxes' madness would eventually reach every household, even the families of the privileged and powerful. He knew that the emperor's violence was expanding slowly, unpredictably, like cracks spreading across marble. And once it reached their daughters, their wives, their sons, there would be no stopping it. The nobles did not think of justice. Justice had no place in this crumbling world. They thought only of survival. Thus, an unspoken conspiracy began to form. It moved lightly, like a shadow slipping beneath doors. There were no speeches, no declarations of rebellion. There was only the shared understanding that Xerxes must die. The plan itself was simple in the way that dangerous things often are. Kill the emperor before he killed everyone else. They chose the New Year festival, a time when Xerxes performed his solitary ritual of divine communion, isolating himself in a private chamber. During those hours, his guards were forbidden to enter, and even the palace staff kept their distance. It was a sacred window of vulnerability. Artabanus would slip inside, accompanied only by a handful of men desperate enough to risk everything. They would strike quickly, a blade to the heart, a blade to the throat, a blade to whatever place would silence him before he could scream. When the deed was done, they would arrange his body and the room to resemble ritual suicide or a sudden death during communion with the divine light. They would set the scene with the precision of actors on a stage. No accusation, no scandal, no truth would be allowed to escape. They were not seeking power. They were not trying to overthrow a king for their own gain. They wanted only to save what pieces of the empire could still be saved. They wanted to protect their children, their lineage, their fragile semblance of order. They wanted to ensure that Persia did not devour itself entirely. In their minds, killing Xerxes was not treason. It was the last attempt to rescue the empire from the man who ruled it. It was a desperate act, born not from courage, but from the haunting knowledge that madness, once unleashed, spares no one, not even those who once stood closest to the throne. Madness in Xerxes was always accompanied by a kind of prophetic suspicion, a sharpened instinct that mistook every shadow for treachery. He began to see betrayal everywhere. Servants disappeared merely for smiling too long, as though happiness itself were an insult to his divinity. Ministers were executed for speaking too softly, as if quiet words carried hidden daggers. He withdrew into the arena, locking himself away from generals, nobles, and emissaries. Only eunuchs and trembling girls were allowed near him. The air within the palace thickened, dense and heavy, as though some unseen surface were cracking beneath the weight of what was coming. Those who moved through the halls walked with the hush of people fearing they would hear the sound of their own doom. Then came the night of the 4th day of the 8th month, in the year 465 before Christ. Xerxes chose a new victim, the youngest he had ever taken, a girl of 11 years who had not yet reached the first threshold of womanhood. He watched her for weeks, waiting for her small body to ripen, as though innocence itself were a fruit meant to be timed and harvested. When he finally decided she was ready, he summoned her to the arena. The palace fell into a silence, so heavy it felt like a warning carved into the air, a silence that seemed to shiver through the walls like a premonition of catastrophe. Artabanus and the conspirators recognized that this night was their only chance. When they learned that Xerxes had entered the arena alone, guarded only by eunuchs stationed outside the chamber, they understood the narrow window fate had opened. According to ritual, once the divine ceremony began, the guards were forbidden to cross the threshold, and beneath the kitchens, the tunnels and side passages, ancient arteries of the palace, would remain unwatched. They slipped into these tunnels, moving through corridors where incense smoke clung to the stone and the lingering scent of old food mixed with the musk of extinguished fires. It was the first time in many years that they carried weapons. But even then, they brought only daggers, small blades, meant to finish a life swiftly, silently, without the echo of steel on stone. When they reached the emperor's private chamber, they saw what no man should ever see. Xerxes, naked and drenched in sweat, held the girl bound in his arms. She cried without sound, her body rigid with terror. The king's face was twisted into an unrecognizable mask, a grotesque fusion of obsession, fury, and the desperate hunger for domination. The ruler, who had once commanded 3 continents, who had crossed seas on bridges of ships, now appeared as nothing more than a broken creature, clinging to the last illusion of his godhood. For a heartbeat, even seasoned soldiers froze. The sight before them made the world tilt, made time hesitate. Artabanus moved first. His dagger pierced Xerxes through the ribs, driving straight into the heart. The emperor turned, his eyes widening not from pain, but from disbelief, the astonishment of a man who had forgotten the possibility of death. "But I am a god," he whispered, as though the words themselves could undo the blade lodged inside him. The second dagger sliced across his throat, freeing a gout of blood that painted the floor in a dark arc. The third cut, unnecessary but fueled by years of fear, rage, and revulsion, tore open his abdomen. Royal blood spilled across the marble, mingling with the blood of the child beneath him. Red threads merging like the final, damning script of a story long overdue for its ending. The King of Kings, once the terror of nations, collapsed not on a battlefield, not beneath the banners of conquering armies, but across the small, trembling body of an 11-year-old girl inside a locked chamber. And in that moment, the last illusion of his divinity shattered, leaving only a silence so profound it seemed the palace itself had stopped breathing. The plot succeeded. The men who had carried the weight of fear for so many years now carried the heavy body of Xerxes through the dim corridors. They washed him, cleansing the blood that stained his skin. They wiped the wounds so that no blade marks remained visible beneath the ritual garments. They laid him upon the ceremonial bed, arranging his hands upon his chest as though he were in silent prayer. Then they lit the sacred fire, letting its glow flicker across the chamber like a final blessing. Before dawn had even touched the horizon, they announced that the king had died during communion with the divine light. The lie settled quickly over the palace. By sunrise, it had hardened into official truth. The very next morning, the throne passed to Artaxerxes I. His rise was sudden but uncontested. No one wished to question a transition that promised stability after years of terror. The new king's first decree was to seal the harem, the place that had become the core of so much hidden suffering. Officially, he claimed it was an act of reverence, a way to honor his father's sacred memory by preserving the space untouched. But the palace whispered a different understanding. It was an attempt to bury what could not be spoken, to cover the rot before it poisoned the entire empire. The surviving women were quietly dispersed. Some were married off hastily to provincial nobles in distant regions, their lives redirected with the stroke of a pen. Others were sent to temples, their futures surrendered to rituals rather than households. None remained in Pepilolis. None were permitted to keep the names they once bore. They vanished into the folds of the empire, absorbed by communities that would never know their pasts. History made no space for them. No scribe recorded their lineage. No poet sang of their sorrow. They became ghosts long before their deaths. The eunuchs, those who had witnessed every secret, who had memorized every horror, were executed one by one. Their deaths came quietly, announced in records with meaningless accusations: theft, blasphemy, treason. These charges were nothing more than thin veils draped over the true reason. They were killed not for crimes committed, but for truths they carried within them, truths that could unravel the delicate facade the new regime was trying so desperately to maintain. Only Mithridates was spared for a brief time. He was not shown mercy. He was kept alive because he alone understood the full scope of what had occurred within the arena. He was ordered to write a confession, a document that would not be filed among the royal archives but hidden away, buried beneath layers of secrecy. He wrote with trembling hands, recounting each ritual, each disappearance, each life extinguished. His words flowed like a dirge, a long sorrow poured onto parchment. When he finished, the confession was sealed, tucked into a chamber where it would lie undisturbed for centuries. Mithridates did not live much longer. His execution came quietly, without ceremony, without witnesses. No one spoke his name afterward. The confession, however, outlived both him and the world he had known. It remained hidden throughout the fall of the Persian Empire, slept through the rise and fall of nations, and waited beneath stone and dust until the day it would finally be uncovered. And so the empire carried on its banners raised high, its temples lit with holy fires, its records polished clean of shame. Yet beneath the official version of events, beneath the silence required to keep an empire whole, the truth persisted, waiting patiently in the darkness for time to loosen the seals men had placed around it. The body of Xerxes was prepared according to the Zoroastrian rites that had been reserved for kings of ancient Persia. His corpse was embalmed with meticulous care, washed in fragrant oils until the skin gleamed with an otherworldly sheen, then wrapped in layers of fine linen. Priests murmured sacred hymns as they guided the procession to the necropolis of Rustam, where the towering stone walls still bore inscriptions proclaiming him King of Kings, Protector of the Weak, Beloved Child of the Divine Light. Those carvings rose proudly beneath the open sky, untouched by time, etched with praises meant to immortalize his greatness. Yet none of those stones mentioned the daughters he had destroyed. None recorded the names that vanished into the arena's darkness. None described the doors that closed like tombs, or the tears that fell silently onto cold marble floors. Official history preserved the brilliance and buried the shadows. For the next 2,000 years, humanity remembered Xerxes for only one thing: his defeat at the hands of Greece. The Battle of Salamis, the Battle of Plataea, those humiliations echoed across centuries, retold by Herodotus with a voice sharpened by irony. Historians in later Persian dynasties dismissed him as an unremarkable figure, a mere bridge between the glory of Darius the Great and the reign of his son Artaxerxes. They flattened his legacy into a footnote. No one spoke of the arena. No one whispered the truth about the girls. Silence stretched across generations like a cloak, heavy and deliberate. This silence, enduring, unbroken, spanning centuries, may have been Xerxes' final victory. For what greater triumph can a tyrant claim than to commit atrocities so vast, so unthinkable, that the world chooses to forget them? A crime buried deeply enough becomes a myth unspoken becomes nothing at all. And so the darkness he created remained entombed, hidden behind the golden reputation carved upon his tomb. Then the 20th century arrived, and the dust of forgotten time began to stir. Archaeologists from distant nations traveled across the old lands of Persia, their hands brushing away sand, stone, and the brittle remnants of ancient walls. They carried with them tools, journals, lanterns, and the unspoken hope of discovering stories long lost to memory. As they knelt before the ruins, tapping gently at the earth, the foundations of concealed secrets trembled. Their picks and brushes scraped at the bones of history. Their ears listened for echoes beneath collapsed ceilings. Their lanterns illuminated chambers that had not seen light in countless lifetimes. And in the shadows of Pepilolis, the heart of an empire that had collapsed centuries before, a different kind of history began to awaken. Not the history taught in classrooms, or written in royal annals, or inscribed upon triumphant stone tablets. This was a history that had never been allowed to breathe. It rose slowly from the rubble, like a whisper long smothered. It clung to broken pillars and curled through empty corridors. It trembled beneath the archaeologists' fingertips as they uncovered fragments that did not match the official tales. This other history, buried under layers of silence, shame, and deliberate omission, stirred like a creature waking from a long, reluctant sleep. And as the dust drifted away from the ruins of Pepilolis, the truth that had been sealed for 2 millennia began, at last, to return to the surface. In the year 1931, a French archaeological team descended into the ruins of ancient Pepilolis, expecting nothing more than the usual remnants of palaces and ceremonial halls. Instead, beneath what seemed to be harmless layers of marble flooring, they uncovered a hidden passageway, leading downward into a space that no chronicle had ever mentioned. Dust billowed as they pried open the sealed stone. The air that greeted them was cold, unnaturally so, and carried a silence so deep it felt like a warning rather than an absence of sound. At the bottom of the passage lay a chamber broad enough to swallow echoes, its walls bare, its corners drowned in shadow. The archaeologists stepped inside, lanterns trembling in their hands. As the light spread, the shapes on the ground sharpened into something unmistakable, rows and clusters of small skeletons, hundreds of them, arranged not with care, but with the disordered logic of bodies discarded over many years. Most were the remains of girls no older than 10 to 12 years. Their bones bore the unmistakable evidence of suffering endured during life, fractures that had healed and fractured again, marks left by restraints, repetitive injuries etched into their limbs and ribs, signs of confinement so prolonged that the bones themselves had warped, curving inward as though trying to protect the fragile hearts once held within them. Some skeletons were missing arms or legs entirely, the severed joints showing clean cuts from blades or saws. Others bore deformations that spoke of torture stretched across months or even years. The chamber seemed to breathe with the weight of what it had witnessed. Those who stood in that room later described a sensation of being watched by the past itself, as though the air carried memories too heavy to dissipate. Scattered among the bones were objects that deepened the horror. A shattered bracelet of hammered gold. A crushed pot of perfumed oil whose scent, faint but enduring, still clung to the fragments. Tiny earrings. Decorative beads. Pieces of glass from once ornate vials. These were adornments meant to beautify, to signify innocence or status or ceremony. Yet here they lay beside the remains of children, forming a grotesque contrast between what was meant to be cherished and what had been brutally destroyed. It was no longer possible to call the rumors exaggerations. No longer possible to dismiss the whispers passed down through generations. The truth had been carved into the very bone. Laboratory studies, conducted over months, confirmed every detail of Mithrates' long-hidden confession. The arena had never been a sanctuary for royal women. It had never been a place of luxury or ritual devotion. It was a place of execution, a machine of death disguised beneath silk and perfume, masked by the splendor of imperial architecture. The injuries revealed patterns of systematic cruelty, repetition, escalation, finality. These were not accidents, not illnesses. They were deliberate acts carried out over decades. Modern tourists who stroll today between the towering stone columns of Pepololis, admiring their symmetry beneath the sky, rarely imagine what lies beneath their feet. They see a city of triumph and imperial order. They read plaques that speak of kings and gods, of ceremonies and conquests. They take photographs of the intricate reliefs carved into the walls. They marvel at the engineering genius of an empire long vanished. But deeper below, beyond the reach of sunlight or casual curiosity, rests a mass grave of children who never had a voice, never had a place in the official histories, never bore names in any dynasty's record. Girls who lived their short lives in rooms without windows, whose suffering was hidden not only by the palace, but by the centuries that followed. Their bones form a silent testimony, a testimony stronger than any inscription carved in stone, stronger than the myths that crowned Xerxes as a god, stronger than the versions of history that polished his image until only glory remained. For beneath the ruins of Pepololis lies the truth he tried to bury. An empire that glittered above ground, while rotting from within. A king praised for greatness, while destroying the most vulnerable lives entrusted to him, and a darkness so vast that time itself tried to cover it until the earth decided to reveal it at last. This story, with all its unbearable cruelty, is not merely the tale of a single man corrupted by power. It is the story of a civilization collapsing from within, undone not by invading armies but by the slow erosion of its own moral foundation. Xerxes was not defeated by Greece. The losses at Salamis and Plataea were only sparks in a much larger fire. His true defeat was born from the divine illusion he wrapped around himself, a belief so absolute that it hardened into madness. When no one dared oppose him, when every witness shielded themselves behind silence, the empire ceased to be the sacred order his father had once shaped. Instead, it became a structure erected upon the suffering of its weakest, and anything built atop pain is destined, sooner or later, to fall. Every empire leaves behind layers of legacy, monuments rising toward the sun, tombs carved into cliffs, victories etched into tablets, laws that outlive their authors. But there is another kind of legacy, one history prefers to look away from the lives crushed quietly beneath the weight of power. In the reign of Xerxes, it is not the fleets he commanded, nor the palaces he expanded, nor the armies he marched across continents that reveal who he truly was. His truth lives in the voices that were never recorded, the hushed cries swallowed by stone walls, the girls erased before they ever had a chance to carry names. They are the mirror that reflects his reign faithfully, without embellishment or grandeur. It is their silence, not his triumphs, that defines his rule. And from that silence emerges a question more important than any battle, treaty, or succession. What happens when absolute power fuses with absolute fear? The answer is written here in the ruins, in the bones, in the history that tried to stay buried. A great empire does not rot from its borders, where enemies gather. It rots from the rooms where children lose their childhood, where innocence is treated as tribute, and where cruelty becomes routine. This decay spreads slowly, invisibly, until the marble pillars begin to crack and the illusions of stability crumble. For Xerxes, the collapse began long before assassins entered his chamber. It began the moment fear replaced justice, the moment obedience replaced compassion, the moment he believed himself beyond the reach of consequence. A tyrant may sit upon a throne of gold, but if that throne is supported by suffering, it is already breaking. And so the Persian Empire under Xerxes became a hollow edifice, a civilization that glittered outwardly while its core was turning to dust. The rituals, the titles, the temples, the armies, they all continued to move as though nothing had changed. But beneath them lay a truth too heavy for the empire to bear. No kingdom survives when the innocent become its fuel. In the end, those forgotten girls, the ones buried beneath the marble floors, held more power than Xerxes ever understood. Their suffering outlasted the walls of Pepololis. Their silence echoed across centuries. Their bones told the story that scribes refused to write. For when history is stripped of its glory, when the victories fade and the monuments crumble, what remains is the cost of power. And here, that cost was measured not in coins or conquests, but in childhoods stolen, in futures extinguished, in the quiet pain of those who had no voice. This, more than any war or rebellion, is the true legacy of Xerxes. The legacy of a ruler who mistook fear for loyalty, who confused domination with divinity, and who never understood that the greatest threat to an empire comes not from the outside, but from the atrocities committed within its own walls. When we look upon Pepololis today, its broken columns rising like ribs of a long-dead giant, its collapsed stairways softened by centuries of dust, its lonely reliefs carved into stone that no longer remembers sunlight, we see the lingering beauty of an empire that once believed itself eternal. The wind moves through the ruins with a soft, wandering voice, brushing against carvings that once celebrated power and triumph. But if one listens closely, beneath the whisper of sand and the shifting breath of the desert air, another sound seems to rise, quiet, trembling, almost too faint to catch. It is the echo of girls who were never allowed to cry aloud, the ones whose voices history never recorded, but whose presence remains etched into the bones of this place. Stone does not lie, and stone does not forget. Every crack along the marble floors, every weathered edge of a pillar, every groove carved into the courtyard tiles stands as a testimony to a truth too dark for ancient scribes to write. The grandeur of the empire, all its splendor and ceremony, could never erase the suffering buried beneath it. In Pepololis, beauty and horror grew together, one towering above ground, the other sinking silently below it. The story of Xerxes reminds us that cruelty does not vanish with time. It leaves traces subtle but enduring in the earth, in the remnants of buildings, and most powerfully, in the collective memory of those willing to face what others tried to hide. The children who died in silence were denied names, denied futures, denied the dignity of being mourned. Yet their existence, and more importantly, their erasure, stands as the most damning indictment of the man who called himself King of Kings. No inscription praising his victories, no monument carved in his honor, no legend of his conquests can overshadow the truth that lies beneath Pepololis. And perhaps the most frightening truth of all is this: his atrocities did not happen because he alone was cruel. They happened because an entire system chose silence. Silence from priests who cloaked power in the language of divinity. Silence from nobles who traded morality for privilege. Silence from officials who feared losing their positions. Silence from those who witnessed suffering but convinced themselves it was not their place to intervene. Silence is not neutral. Silence is participation. It is silence that builds thrones for tyrants. It is silence that transforms cruelty into tradition. It is silence that allows horrors to repeat themselves across generations, long after the first scream has faded. In this way, the empire that Xerxes ruled was undone not only by his actions, but by the consent of the many who looked away. Today, Pepololis stands as more than a ruin. It is a warning carved into stone, a reminder that the past does not disappear. It waits beneath the dust, beneath the narratives crafted by victors, beneath the comfortable myths that allow civilizations to forget their darkest hours. And when the truth finally emerges, as it did in the year 1931, it demands that we see not only what was done, but what was ignored. Those unnamed girls, buried in silence, are not just victims of a long-lost empire. They are the mirror in which we are meant to see ourselves. They ask a question that echoes across the centuries. drifting through the broken arches of Pepololis, whispering beneath the wind. Who will speak when the world chooses silence? And woven into that question is a final truth, gentle, haunting, and impossible to forget. Silence may protect the powerful, but it never protects the innocent. In the quiet that follows a long and heavy story, let yourself breathe a little slower, as though the world around you is dimming its lights, inviting you to step gently out of the shadows we have walked through together. The ruins of Pepololis, the echoes of forgotten girls, the weight of an empire's silence, all of it can now drift softly to the edges of your mind, like dust settling after a long journey. You do not need to hold the images sharply anymore. Let them blur, soften, fade into a distant hum, as though you are watching them from far across a calm shoreline. Because at its heart, this story was never meant to frighten you, but to remind you quietly, tenderly, that even the darkest chapters of history carry lessons meant to guide us towards something gentler. The cruelty of Xerxes, the silence that allowed suffering to grow, the voices lost beneath marble floors, all of it speaks in one shared truth, that power without compassion collapses, and silence in the face of pain becomes a shadow that touches every generation. But the fact that we can look back now, with tenderness instead of fear, means something too. It means we are capable of seeing what others tried to hide. It means we can hold space for those who were forgotten, giving them at last a moment of remembrance. And in doing so, we shape a world where their suffering is not repeated, where empathy becomes stronger than silence, and where even the faintest whisper of a lost life can still teach us how to be kind. So, as the final frames of this story dim, imagine the ruins of Pepololis at dusk, the desert wind drifting softly through broken columns, carrying away the last remnants of sorrow. Imagine the ground growing still, as if offering a gentle lullaby to the past. And imagine yourself stepping back from it all, wrapped in calm, knowing that the cruelty of yesterday becomes wisdom only when someone chooses to remember and someone chooses to tell the truth. Tonight, you were that someone. Now let your breath settle. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the quiet return to you like a warm blanket. And as you drift toward rest, hold only this, that history, when faced with open eyes and an open heart, becomes not a burden, but a guide. Sleep gently, my friend. Sleep knowing you are safe, and that the night carries only peace. And before your eyes close completely, remember to subscribe to the channel, so you never miss the stories we bring to life. Stories told softly, honestly, and always with you in mind. Inside the tower, Anne faced her first night as a prisoner. The physical comfort of her chambers could not soften the terror that crept over her. Her thoughts spiraled through fear, disbelief, and a fragile hope that still fluttered, faint but persistent. Her mood was visibly deteriorating. She paced, wept, and tried to steady herself, though her mind felt pulled in too many directions at once. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, came to speak with her. He was responsible for her confinement, but he was not a cruel man. He observed her with the calm professionalism expected of someone who had overseen the imprisonment of nobles before. Anne clung to him as a source of information, perhaps hoping for clarity or even comfort. She repeated what she had insisted earlier to the Privy Council, that she was the king's lawful wife. Her voice was strained but determined, as though repeating this truth might somehow protect her. Then she asked Kingston the question that had been echoing inside her since her arrest. Did he know why she had been brought here? Kingston replied that he did not. Whether that was honesty or a necessary lie, no one could say. Perhaps he truly did not know the depth of Cromwell's accusations, or perhaps he understood that any truth he offered would only worsen her despair. Anne's desperation grew. She asked after those who had always stood by her, particularly her father, Thomas Boleyn. She wanted reassurance that he was fighting for her, that he was petitioning the king, that he was refusing to abandon his daughter. But the reality, cold and unyielding, was that Thomas Boleyn had already withdrawn into silence. Fear for his own life and status outweighed paternal duty. He could not or would not oppose Cromwell's rising tide. In choosing self-preservation, he left Anne more alone than she had ever been. Meanwhile, at Whitehall, Henry retired to his chambers alone. His wife, the woman he had once defied nations for, was imprisoned, and the palace that had once echoed with their ambition now held only his solitary footsteps. Throughout the day, he had maintained a veneer of calm, even cheerfulness, distracting himself with feasts, conversations, and the company of other women. But when Cromwell's detailed report of accusations reached him that night, something shifted. According to accounts from those near him, Henry wept as he read the charges. Tears slid down the face of the king, who had once celebrated Anne's triumphs and now presided over her ruin. But were those tears genuine? Did they reflect sorrow for Anne or sorrow for himself? This question has lingered for centuries. Some have imagined Henry grieving the collapse of a love he had once believed in. Others, including Tracy, suggest something more complicated, that Henry's tears were not for Anne at all, but for the man he believed himself to be. A man who had chosen Anne, elevated her, reshaped England, for her only to feel betrayed by her alleged infidelity. In this interpretation, the tears were not a sign of empathy, but of wounded pride. The king who had gambled everything on Anne now felt humiliated by the idea that she might have deceived him. Thus his sorrow, if it can be called sorrow, was a twisted, self-focused grief. The grief of a man who saw himself as the injured party. Back in the Tower, Anne knew nothing of Henry's tears, real or imagined. She knew only the silence of the stone walls and the growing sense that her world had tilted irrevocably. As night settled over London, she lay awake in the chambers, once meant to honour her, listening to the faint footsteps in the corridor and wondering whether dawn would bring mercy or destruction. The machinery of her downfall was already in motion, and Cromwell, ever patient, was tightening every bolt. Night settled over the Tower of London with a heaviness that seemed almost alive, as though the ancient stones themselves exhaled the weight of centuries. Shadows stretched long across the courtyards, and the murmurs of guards faded into the kind of silence that presses against the ribs. It was in this atmosphere, thick with dread, with memory, with the whispered legends of ghosts, that Anne found herself utterly alone in the Queen's lodgings. Though her chambers were still furnished with the luxury befitting a queen, the air inside them felt cold, hollow, stripped of comfort. Silk curtains whispered faintly with each draught, and the gilded carvings on the walls seemed to shrink away from her. Here, surrounded by reminders of her brief glory, she confronted the unbearable uncertainty of what awaited her. Sleep would not come. Hope flickered weakly, but fear of the unknown, of betrayal, of death pressed more tightly around her than any velvet mantle. It was during this long, suffocating night that one of the most famous letters in Tudor history was said to have been written. A letter attributed to Anne, addressed to Henry, composed from within the Tower. Whether every word is truly hers remains debated, but the emotions carried in its lines feel strikingly real, a mixture of pride, desperation, and lingering belief in justice. In the letter, Anne pleaded, "Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and judges, for my truth shall fear no open shame." These words, delicate yet fierce, were the voice of a woman who refused to bow completely to despair. She was frightened, yes, she was overwhelmed, but she still held to the idea that truth, her truth, might prevail. Even as Cromwell's machinery tightened around her, even as accusations multiplied, she believed a fair trial could save her. The letter revealed her faith not in Henry's love, which had already vanished, but in the rule of law she hoped he would honour. It was the final echo of the woman Henry had once adored, intelligent, articulate, unwavering in her sense of dignity. Yet Anne could not know that the trial she begged for had already been shaped, moulded, manipulated, long before she entered the courtroom. Her enemies, sworn, powerful, and numerous, were already in place. The charges were ready. The outcome was all but inscribed in stone. The Tower walls, if they could speak, might have told her the truth. That no lawful trial awaited her, only a performance crafted for politics, for spectacle, for the satisfaction of a king who wished to rewrite his past. But in this moment, this fragile, trembling moment, she still believed. She paced the room, her steps muffled by thick rugs. Sometimes she sat motionless, staring into the darkened corners where the flickering candlelight couldn't reach. Sometimes she whispered prayers under her breath. Outside, a distant bell tolled the hours. Inside, she held tightly to the idea that justice, however faint, might still be within reach. The episode of her story ends with a question suspended in the air. Would Anne receive the fair trial she begged for? History, of course, provides the answer. She was executed on the 19th of May. Her trial, swift, biased, and devastating, sealed her fate long before she walked into the courtroom. But the structure of the narrative lingers on that moment in her chamber, on the plea written into the shadows of the Tower, allowing us to feel the ache of what she felt. Because in that room, while the city slept and the river whispered below the walls, Anne Boleyn still hoped. She still believed that truth could triumph, that justice could withstand politics, that her husband might yet remember the woman he once loved. It is that hope, fragile, misguided, heartbreakingly human, that remains suspended in the dark, long after the candle in her chamber burned out. And as the final notes fade, the viewer is left with a tightness in the throat, knowing what Anne could not. That hope, for her, was already slipping away. As the story slowly comes to a close, let the images that have passed begin to soften, like the final ripples on the surface of the Thames as evening settles in. Imagine the warm golden light gently spreading across the ancient walls of the Tower of London, where Anne Boleyn once endured the longest night of her life. And then, just as the night embraces the city, we allow the story to drift quietly into the distance, as gently as a breath. Anne stepped into history not only because of her tragedy, but because of the message her life leaves behind. That power, no matter how high, is as fragile as glass, that even the strongest hearts can be swept away by the winds of ambition and circumstance, and that human beings, whether kings or queens, carry within them fear, hope, and a longing to be understood. Anne was not only a fallen queen, she is a reminder that behind the darkness of grand palaces there are still small, beating souls trying to hold on to what they believe is right. Now, let your shoulders relax, and allow the quiet that flows from this story to settle around you. The sounds of that distant court fade one by one, the water brushing against the side of a boat, footsteps on damp stone, even the whisper of letters that never reached their intended hands, all drifting away, leaving behind a space that feels soft, peaceful, and still. Let your mind rest in the knowledge that although the story was filled with storms, it also carries a gentle truth, that pride, honesty, and faith in justice, even when crushed, remain small lanterns that keep the darkness from swallowing everything. And sometimes, simply keeping those lanterns alive inside ourselves is enough to help us walk through the long days of our own lives. So now, allow your eyes to close as lightly as petals. Let your breathing slow, round, and warm. And let the story of a queen who lived, who loved, who fought, and who hoped, lull you gently towards sleep. I wish you a very good night, deep and restful. And if you would like to continue this journey with us, these soft stories, these quiet pieces of history whispered into the dark, feel free to subscribe so you won't miss any of our newest and best videos. Wishing you a peaceful night. Until we meet again in the next dream.